So I am posting this video for those of you who were asking me for additional assistance in helping you to write your final papers. So what you have in front of you right now is a collection of excerpts from midterm papers that you wrote for me. And I've taken about 3 or 4 outstanding midterm papers and pulled out some moments from these outstanding midterm papers that will allow me to show to you in very concrete detail what I'm looking for as you're writing your final papers. Sometimes it's easier to see good writing and then try to emulate it than it is for me to describe it for you and then you to try to imagine what that writing would actually look like in practice. And so what I'm giving you is a practical kind of model that you can use and hopefully mimic to do the kind of work that you're going to be doing in your final paper, which is not just dealing with one text, but with 2 texts. I've put an aid on Blackboard that will help you in putting 2 texts into conversation with one another as well. So your paper will be composed of an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, as all essays are. And so what this video is going to show you in brief is what you should be doing in the introductory part of your paper, how you should be doing your quote analysis in the body of your paper, and what is an effective way of concluding your paper. What's a nice way of wrapping things up? So the papers, as I said before you, are papers. Not all of these papers have gotten A's, a lot of them have, but the moments that I'm going to highlight for you from these papers are certainly A moments from these papers. So how to begin? What should you be doing in the introduction to your final paper? Well, one thing that I often tell students to do is when you're writing your paper, the first thing you're going to write, the first thing most students write is their introduction, and then they go through and they work through their argument and then they conclude the paper. And when they revise, they don't think about how they're going to revise their introduction. Now, that's problematic because your introduction really should give a preview for all the pages that are going to follow. Now, if you're going to just write it one time and not revise it later on, there's no way before writing your paper you're going to know what your paper will end up saying. So one of the things I suggest students to do is to write your entire paper with a provisional introduction in place, and then after you've gotten to the bottom of the last page and you know what you've already written, you know what arguments you've made, what points you want to make, now go back and rewrite your introduction. Rewrite your introduction in such a way that it gives me a preview of everything that you're going to accomplish in pages 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so a couple of examples of this from the midterms are, I'll read you some of these examples. So this is a paper that dealt with King Richard II. Kings hold no power except the power that they are granted. It is true that kings hold a lot of responsibilities, such as going to war, creating peace, and generally making decisions that will benefit their kingdoms or expand their empires. But who gives them their power? In William Shakespeare's play Richard II, the monarch's legitimacy is derived from forces both divine forces and the king's subjects. This is a very clear thesis sentence about how a monarch becomes legitimate. It's very clearly stated, and it is also a preview of what the student is going to do in the subsequent pages. Now the student tells me, after making this claim, they've made a claim. Now they're going to support that claim through a key scene. A key scene, the third scene of the third act, demonstrates both types of legitimacy and is important to the play as a whole due to its employment of monarchical themes and its plot points that lead to the downfall of Richard II and subsequent rise of Henry Bolingbroke. Notice what the student is doing. The student is giving me a preview of what's going to come. The student is going to talk about Act 3, Scene 3. The student is going to talk about why this scene is important because it demonstrates what the student has just written in the previous sentence. So this is an example of a good introduction. I'll give you another example as well. Here's another introduction that gives a nice sense of what's going to come. Putting on a disguise plays a very important role in Shakespeare's play Henry IV. Prince Hal, the later to become king, puts on a disguise in order to become acquainted with the common people of the kingdom. He often hangs out in a tavern with common friends, one of whom is a thief named Falstaff. Prince Hal hangs out in a tavern for a specific reason, that is to learn about his subjects while he waits for his time to carry out his royal duties and fight with his father. He socializes and learns the way of the common people without allowing them to influence him negatively. That's a nice statement also. Prince Hal uses this knowledge so that he may become an influential and well-renowned leader later on. The significance of Prince Hal taking on a disguise is so that he may astound the nobility and common people by presenting them with an unexpected transformation. That's also a very, very key statement for what the student is going to do in the subsequent pages. Again, it's a nice, brief sentence, right? No more than 10 to 15 words for those of you who write run-on sentences. That succinctly declares what the student is going to prove throughout the rest of the paper. The transformation of Prince Hal can be compared to King Henry's rise to the throne. And this is the scene that they're going to look at where this comparison is made explicit. Both King Henry and Prince Hal show their leadership in very similar yet also very different ways, and that's also important as well. You want to declare in your argument both similarities and differences, right? Because no two Shakespeare plays are exactly alike, although they may deal with similar themes. The scene of King Henry talking about his rise to power, or talking about his rise to the throne, is a great way to compare how King Henry and Prince Hal got their royal fame. Again, succinct, a declaration of what the student is going to prove, and also a sense of what scene the student is going to use in order to demonstrate this. Another example of a nice opening paragraph. Now, I'm going to also transition now to the body paragraph. And for body paragraph analysis, for close quote analysis, it is really important for you to pick out key moments from the text that allow you to explain what's going on within the text. The best kind of quote is that quote that allows you to figure out what else Shakespeare is saying besides what the words are stating. So here's an example of a quote from Henry IV, Part 1. King Henry says, "Stay and breathe a while, thou hast redeemed thy lost opinion, and showed thou makest some tender of my life. In this fair rescue thou hast brought to me." So it's a nice quote because what the student is going to do is the student is going to look at specific words in the quote. That's very important. Looking at specific words in the quote in order to make some conclusions. Only after a drawn-out battle, when Prince Hal comes in to rescue his father, does King Henry recant all the allegations he made against his son. King Henry says to Hal that he has redeemed an opinion he thought to be lost. However, for something to be lost means that it had to exist at some point. Notice what the student is doing. The student is making this analysis through the words "redeemed thy lost opinion." The student is focusing in on these words, "redeem thy lost opinion," to make the analysis that in order for something to be lost, it means that it had to exist at some point. So, now that you've made this observation, why is this consequential? Why should I care? The follow-up sentence tells me why I should care. This reveals that though King Henry always voiced his negative opinions about his son, subconsciously he knew that somewhere in Hal was the ability to become a respectable king. This is why the previous observation matters. It's a nice little bit of analysis using the text in order to reach a conclusion, which is the subconsciousness of King Henry. This is not something that's explicitly stated in the play. The student is able to derive this analysis from the words of the play. The relationship between King Henry and Prince Hal shows Shakespeare to showcase the importance of kingship over family relationships. Shakespeare is saying that blood relations do not compare to the family that is built when it comes to monarchy. Honor and family become intertwined. And so this idea that the family you're born to and the family name you earn are two things that are intertwined with one another, and this is something that's very, very specific to monarchy. A monarchical family is not like any other family. A monarchical family has certain members that are born to it, but nevertheless, the family is built. The structure of that family is built not only through birthright, but through the ways in which you build family. You cannot have one without the other. And so this is a nice bit of analysis, all of this deriving from this moment in the text where Prince Hal redeems lost opinion, right? It's this, everything down over here comes out of this little bit of quote analysis. And it's good work. It's good work. Let me give you another example of good analytical work with the quote. This is a moment where the student talks about the breadth of kings. We remember that moment from Richard II, right? There are multiple instances where the breadth of kings come into play within this scene, all of which continue to show the power of changing fate. The king reduces Bolingbroke's sentence to 6 years rather than 10. Bolingbroke himself explicitly mentions the power of the breadth of kings. And here's the quote: "How long a time lies in one little word, 4 lagging winters and 4 wanton springs, and in a word such as the breadth of kings." The reduced term gives Bolingbroke the impression that his entire life has changed because of the king's words. This sentence is a derivation of this quote about the breadth of kings. He recognizes the king's ability and power over time itself. This is the consequence. This is why this analysis matters. The significance in this interaction is not just the reduced term, but also in Bolingbroke's recognition of the breadth of kings. He clearly sees the power that the king has and is the only one throughout the play to explicitly, and notice how the student italicizes this word to draw attention to the fact that Bolingbroke is the only one who explicitly calls attention to the fact that the power that the king has lies in his breadth. In recognizing the breadth of kings, he will later be able to reproduce it. That's nice analysis. As stated in the name of the ability itself, the power to use the breadth of kings is reserved to those who rule. If Bolingbroke is able to reproduce the effects of the breadth of kings, it will be a reflection of his ability to rule. Notice what the student has done, right? The student has, and the student uses this to say this is an example of foreshadowing, of Bolingbroke's rise to the throne being foreshadowed. The student has used this moment where Bolingbroke has invoked this breadth of kings to make a statement about Bolingbroke's worthiness to himself become king later on. It's nice analysis. It's really nice analysis. Now, one other thing that you've got to do is not just find good individual quotes, but also to be able to pair those quotes with other quotes in the text, or, for the sake of your final paper, outside of the text as well. So what does the student do? The student juxtaposes this breadth of kings quote next to a different quote from a different moment in the text and makes a wonderful bit of analysis in connecting these two moments. Look at the next paragraph. The king's power to change fate does have restrictions. It is not a limitless power that occurs with any decree. This restriction is shown in John of Gaunt's reaction to Bolingbroke's sentence. He is overcome with grief and explains the king's limits through his own incoming death. But not a minute, king. The student could have probably introduced this quote a little bit better by saying that this is John of Gaunt's speech. It's his deathbed speech, right? But the juxtaposition of John of Gaunt's deathbed speech next to the previous breadth of kings quote is important because of this. But not a minute, king, that thou canst give shorten my days. Thou canst with sullen sorrow and pluck nights from me, but not lend a morrow. Thou canst help time to furrow me with age, but stop no wrinkle in his pilgrimage. Thy word is current with him for my death, but dead thy kingdom cannot buy my breath. Notice what the student is doing. The student is juxtaposing two different quotes, each of which mention breath. In order to make what point? Why are you putting these two quotes next to one another? The restriction is the impossibility of adding time to a person's fate. The breath of kings can control fate through decreasing time, but it will never be able to add. Thus, it can be said that the breath of kings is limited by the constraints of human ability. This is important. Even for a king, it is impossible to increase one's lifespan. King Richard tries to tell John of Gaunt that he has many days left to live, but John recognizes the impossibility of this statement. It is, however, possible to end one's lifespan through death, as seen in Mowbray's death later on in the story. John also remarks on the king's ability to shorten his days. He implies that the king's punishment of Bolingbroke will cause him to die sooner. This is another aspect of the Breath of Kings that is hinted at in this scene and comes to fruition later. In the later scene, King Richard actually wishes for John's death to come, which actually happens in the opening of Act 2. So notice what the student is doing. The student is pointing out in one instance where the Breath of Kings kind of gives an authenticity to a monarch, but in the next moment, the Breath of Kings is invoked in order to show the limits of a monarch's power, right? You can delay things, right? You can shorten days, but you cannot extend time. See what the student's done? A monarch has the ability to do this through his breath, but he does not have the ability to do this. These two quotes put next to one another really do a nice job of showing the power of a king, but also the limits of a king's power as well. And this kind of analysis can only come when you choose the right quotes and put them next to one another and derive analysis from this. I'm going to end this little video with just a demonstration of how you should end your paper, okay? So I'm going to pull out 3 consecutive pages, the last 3 pages from one student's paper, who did a very, very nice job, and I'm going to point out a couple of key things. Whenever you want to conclude your paper, what you'd like to do is not just to summarize, to restate everything you've stated in the previous pages, but what you'd like to do is you'd like to, after you've given specific moments from the text, you'd like your conclusion to basically say, this is an important theme because. This is why we should continue to consider this theme as important even after we finish reading this play, or even after we finish reading these 2 plays, because this theme has relevance and significance to human beings in general. So, the quote that I'd like to begin with is this quote about Douglas. It's the fight scene at the end of Henry IV, Part 1, where you'll remember where Douglas encounters a number of people who are dressed up, disguised as the king, right? The decoy kings. And here's the quote. Douglas says, "Another king, they grow like Hydra's heads. I am the Douglas, fatal to all those that wear these colors on them. What art thou that counterfeitest the person of a king?" Now, these lines could be interpreted as a simple misunderstanding on the part of Douglas. However, it is possible that they hold a more complex meaning. Nice sentence. If one considers the fact that Henry IV came to power by usurping the last monarch, then Douglas's words take on a more denunciatory tone. In line 24, Douglas compares a king to a hydra head of Greek mythos, a hydra being a creature known for being able to regrow its head after decapitation. Notice what the student has done. This is nice. The student has used Shakespeare's reference to the hydra to point out the fact that even after you lop off the head of the body, in some instances that head can grow back. Again, leading back to this idea that although Richard II was deposed, the head of state was taken off, another head could grow in its place. This could be a reference to the fact that the state is able to survive without its head. Should the head of the state ever be decapitated, the state could simply create a new one. This is significant because it establishes that a king can be created, but he can also be destroyed and replaced. Notice what the student has done. This is what the student, this is the point that the student wanted to build towards. And they are only able to build towards this point by choosing this hydra-headed quote and explaining the significance of it. Line 27 is a direct questioning of Henry IV's right to assume the role of king. In different phrasing, it is Douglas asking, who are you, Henry Bolingbroke, to disguise yourself as a king? The underlying message is that, yes, kingship is something that someone can be given by God at birth, but in order to keep one's role as king, one must appeal to the people. This is, again, nice analysis deriving from that hydra-headed quote. If one does not, there can always be another head created. That's the point that the student wants to make. It truly is a matter of disguise or die. This is something Prince Harry knows, something Prince Henry IV has forgotten, and something Falstaff illuminates in his soliloquy. Notice what the student is doing. They're taking this hydra quote and they are using it as a lead-in to Falstaff's soliloquy that also deals with this idea of disguise or die. Notice what the student has done. The student has introduced this idea of what the stakes of assuming disguise successfully are. It's either disguise or die. And they put this quote right next to the Falstaff quote over here. Counterfeit? I lie, I'm no counterfeit. To die is to be counterfeit. For he is but the counterfeit of a man who hath no life of a man. But to counterfeit dying when a man thereby liveth is to be no counterfeit, but to be the true and perfect image of life instead. Again, a judicious use of this quote next to the Hydra quote. Look, notice what the student does with this. Despite the comedic theme surrounding Falstaff and his cowardice in this passage, he speaks to the reason successful rulers disguise themselves. But it is also a validation of the role of disguise. Notice the student is going from the specific instance of why rulers disguise themselves to the larger issue of the validation of the role of disguise. This is occurring right towards the end of the student's paper. I want to make this point about how to conclude a paper. On one hand, this passage is ridiculing Falstaff for escaping death by being the ultimate coward and playing dead. But on the other hand, if studied, this passage is really about examining what it means to play a role. And this is the point the student wants to make. The larger point that I would like to conclude my paper by saying is that Shakespeare is interested in what it means to play a role. This is why we should care about disguise in Henry IV, because understanding disguise in Henry IV lets us understand the larger theme of what it means to play a role that we can find in other Shakespeare plays as well. This is how you want to conclude. What makes someone a counterfeit or a fraud? At what point does one wear a mask too long that it becomes as familiar as what is natural? Good questions. Falstaff posits that death itself is just another role, and that any role is taken or disguise worn to avoid that last role, and is in the service of life. If death be false, then life must be true. It's an interesting idea. The concept that life is true. It opens the question, is it enough to just live an experience in order for it to be true? Notice how the student is really coming up with a lot of provocative philosophical questions that Shakespeare is raising, even in this comedic moment. Can one's lived role, one's disguise, become one's truth? I think Shakespeare is saying that for the monarch it is possible. Out of necessity to disguise oneself as a good ruler, it is possible to become one. Notice what a nice job the student has done. Sometimes it's necessary to disguise yourself as a good ruler, but sometimes that disguise becomes the way to actually be a good ruler. The mask fits the face, and eventually the face becomes the mask. The student ends with these last two paragraphs about disguise. This theme of disguise in playing roles is not just in Act 5, Scene 4. It's throughout the play and many other Shakespeare works as well. Beautiful. This is just one example of a scene in which it was particularly discernible Harry's pretense of degeneracy being used as a disguise to hide his true nature, the joke he plays on Falstaff where he disguises himself as a robber in order to expose his cowardice, or even Falstaff's extravagant performance, are all textual proofs that disguise or role plays a motif. Notice, using specific textual moments to make a larger point about the motif of the play, the larger play. At first, Shakespeare's portal of the types of disguise people wear and how they use them might seem a little cynical. However, I believe that Hal's redemption can be looked at as a proof that despite all the other false pretenses, even a contrived goodness still has merit. Do the dancers at the masquerade cease being beautiful to behold because one knows they are wearing masks? In the end, everyone plays a role. And again, the point I want to make is about the conclusion. You want to conclude a paper, if you can, by tracing the larger implications of why your analysis of this play and this particular theme is important. Everyone plays a role and wears disguises. In the circumstance of the king, the disguise has higher stakes. The importance of disguise to a successful ruler is the ability to convince his subjects to remain loyal, because without that ability, the state will create a new head. Disguise can be a defense mechanism or an offensive strategy, but just maybe a disguise could one day also become the truth. Very nice. So I hope all these examples have given you some sense of what I'm kind of looking for in your final papers. I'm available to you through email if you have any questions about your own paper or about this presentation, and I look forward to reading those final papers as well.